Facing death is something we will all eventually have to do for ourselves, walking that lonesome valley, as the old gospel song says. And that's the moment I had arrived at. I was driving into San Antonio. Drizzle turned into a downpour as I approached my early morning medical appointment, and I missed my damn exit. My appointment was with a geneticist, and the news he had to tell me was literally life or death. As much as I wanted to know the results of these tests, maybe I kind of also didn't want to know. My father and years later my brother both died from Huntington's disease. It's a rare disease, and when I was a teenager and my father was first diagnosed, I had never heard of it. It's famously associated with folk singer Woody Guthrie, who died from it. It's a genetic disease of the central nervous system. The most important facts about it for me were: one, my father's diagnosis meant I had a 50-50 chance of inheriting the disease. Two, anyone who gets the gene will get the disease. It's never recessive. And three, the disease is always fatal, 100%, and not a quick, painless death. I saw the symptoms with my father and my brother: personality changes, loss of coordination and balance, uncontrollable movements that begin as a twitching of fingers and toes and eventually become perpetual spasms of the arms and legs and finally the torso. It's a years-long decline, losing control of the body and the mind. By the end, with my father and later with my brother, they couldn't swallow without choking or aspirating, couldn't eat or drink by mouth, couldn't reason, speak, walk, stand. In both their cases, it was a brutal 15 years or so from diagnosis till the end. And I dreaded it more than anything. Would I go down that same road? But I had to live without knowing, because in my young adulthood, there wasn't an accurate test for it. My father had been diagnosed mostly based on his symptoms. The genetic breakthroughs we take for granted now hadn't happened yet. Back then, it was just, 50-50, may the force be with you. But I knew that if I allowed it, those coin toss odds could destroy my life, whether I had the disease or not. Because why do or try anything? Why build relationships, pursue goals, develop a life, right? But nihilism is a choice, and I chose different. I decided to live as if I had the same chance at a life as anybody else. Because I didn't choose to live in an emotional straitjacket of potentially unfounded worry over a fate that might not even happen. And even if I were fated to go down that dark road, why ruin my healthy time, obsessing over a horrific future? Why let the disease win twice, robbing me of even the good years I could have enjoyed? Most Huntington's patients begin to show symptoms in their 30s and 40s, but some people don't get sick until much later. I could have a lot of good years, even if I had the disease. Further, not one person on planet Earth has thus far been born with a guarantee of good health and long life. People die every day. Heart attacks, car wrecks, stray bullets, and the list goes on. So as a very young man, I summoned my will and my cognitive energy, and I shoved those anxieties behind a brick wall into the smallest corner of my mind, tried to live each day as if I were not walking around with a genetic bullseye brightly tattooed to my basic brain functions. That's what I did, and it worked for me for a long time. I more or less kept calm and carried on. I was able to build a productive and satisfying life for myself. In the time since my brother's diagnosis had been confirmed, I earned a master's degree, became a published scholar, poet, and essayist, taught courses at the University of Texas, did a good job as my brother's primary caregiver for almost 4 years. And I had a fine time being a stay-at-home dad for my son Dylan and my daughter Cassidy. I learned to juggle pretty badly, but I could do it. And I became a mediocre guitar player and a damn good cook. I lost a lot of Scrabble games, but won more. Drank a beer or two, watched some football, and enjoyed a happy marriage with my wife. She understood that I was at risk, but was on board with living as if this doom weren't hanging over really our heads at that point. And when the thought would surface unbidden, hey, dude, don't forget, you might die a horrible death, I was always able to send it back to its corner. That was true when my father died, when I was taking care of my brother, even when my wife and I were thinking about having children. We had decided, well before we were ready for that step, that the threat of Huntington's wouldn't stop us because it was 50-50. Even with this risk, I would not have chosen never to have lived. Actually, having kids confirmed our thinking. Whatever was going to happen, I couldn't imagine Dylan and Cassidy never having been. But time brings change. As I moved more into the at-risk age, I found myself second guessing every instance of clumsiness or absent-mindedness or poor judgment, which I have sometimes. It had all begun to weigh on me. And not just me. As I moved into a more at-risk age, my wife became consumed with worry about Huntington's. She kept it to herself rather than talking about it. She withdrew emotionally from the marriage, and it felt like she was watching me through a microscope. The damage to our marriage from this period of time manifested in lots of ways, and it did eventually prove irreconcilable. We were never close again and eventually divorced. I was no longer part of an us. And of course, I worried about my kids. If I had the gene, my kids would be in the same 50-50 boat I was in. But if my results were good, they're free and clear forever. At the same time period, when I had reached a more at-risk age and the worry about Huntington's escalated, there were breakthroughs in testing. For a long time, there was just no way to know. And then there was a genetic test, but it wasn't a great option. The chance of an inconclusive result was too great, and that would have been devastating for me. Only a few places in the country could do it, and they'd need to get blood samples from several family members, affected and unaffected. So it was complicated, and it was expensive. But the science outran my reservations. New tests had very much fewer inconclusive results, and for the new iteration of the test, they needed only my blood. They could do it as close as San Antonio, and it was much more affordable. So I bit the bullet. My doctor put me in touch with a neurologist who looped in a geneticist. They told me about a specific protocol we'd have to follow. First, I'd have to be evaluated by a psychiatrist, and he'd have to say I was emotionally stable enough to handle it if the news were bad. Testing positive for Huntington's, as you can imagine, comes with a vast risk for self-harm. And yeah, I did have those kind of thoughts. After I'd answered his assessment items and the psychiatrist and I had a long conversation, his report stated that I was not only sane, but highly resilient and very emotionally stable. I might have bullshitted him just a little bit. Then I had to meet with the geneticist to make sure I understood the science of it well enough to understand my results. Another A+ on the test, and I advanced to the main event. They drew blood, they sent it off to one of those genetic labs. I was told I'd have the results in about 3 weeks. I can confirm the waiting is the hardest part. The brick wall I had used to compartmentalize this huge worry was crumbling. I was watching the calendar. I was trying to do my writing, trying to meet my deadlines, trying to teach my classes, trying to stay on top of my grading. The kids were trying my patience. My own kids, I mean, not my students, though, them too. I was on edge all the time. I was drinking way more than the recommended dosage. When the 3 weeks had elapsed, and then another day, and then another day, I called the geneticist to say, hey man, I'm real curious about my results. And he said, it's unusual, it never happens, but there was a delay at the lab. It'll be at least another week. Unbelievable. That week passed, and this time he called me. New and different delay. It's hard to say when I'd know anything. They'd reach out. My sample had been taken April 9th, and finally on May 21st, late in the afternoon, I got the call. Be here first thing tomorrow morning. Your results are in. You have to get them in person. So early that Thursday, I set out myself through that lonesome valley, braced for the worst. Heavy clouds, light rain. The time passed in a blur. I'd been obsessed with death for weeks. And now I would know. When they opened the office door, I'd be standing right there. I was almost there when the rain went from drizzle to downpour, and that's about when I missed that exit. I got turned around and was only a few minutes late. The doctor came out to meet me in the waiting room and told me to come back to the office. We walked down a corridor, 30 feet that felt like 30 miles. Stepped into his office, he shut the door, and before I could even sit down, he said, "Mr. Knight, it's good news.